Hello, everyone. Welcome to Microaggressions in Academic Libraries, which is the last webinar of the Combating Racism in Libraries Part 2 series. As you may know, this webinar series is sponsored by the Ethnic Services Roundtable, the Public Library section, and the Instruction Development, Equity, and Access section. Thank you for attending this webinar on this very important topic. Before I turn it over to Kelly to introduce our speaker, a few housekeeping notes. Please make sure that your microphone and camera are off during the duration of the webinar. This will improve video and sound quality during the presentation. Also, feel free to use the questions and answers section with any comments or questions you have throughout the webinar. We'll take some time during the presentation and also at the end to answer them. And also this webinar and all the webinars in the series are being recorded and all the recordings and materials shared will be sent in a follow-up email at most a week after this session. Finally, we will be sending out a follow-up survey directly after the webinar. So please make sure to fill that out because your feedback is important to shape the future of the series. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Kelly to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Christina. Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly Yim, and I am the past president of Public Library Section and supervising librarian at the New York Public Library. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our second annual webinar series of Combating Racism in Libraries, Creating Spaces to Educate and Inform Our Communities. Today's session is supported by PLS, ESRT, and IDEAS. If you're interested in supporting this work, I highly encourage you to join our sections and roundtables at NYLA. I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's event, Microaggressions in Academic Libraries. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker, Janie Alabi. She is a research and instruction librarian for the areas of English, psychological sciences, and African American and Africana studies, as well as coordinator of the RBD Help Desk at Auburn's University Ralph Brown Drawn Library. Before joining Auburn University, she served as the English librarian at Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis. In addition to her MLIS, Jana also holds a Master of Arts in English, both from the University of Albany. Her research focuses on the effects of racial microaggressions on the library profession. So Jana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kelly. And I did a little bit of a switcheroo on the title here. As I was putting this together, I realized what I'm really doing is drawing from psychology literature and hoping to share that with library folks. So a lot of the research that I was pulling together for this was less about things that are specifically happening in different types of libraries and more about microaggressions in general, sort of as they're applied to libraries and how we can deal with them and cope with them. So I've switched the title up a little bit. I hope that nobody is too upset with that. But I do want to kind of start out and sort of position myself here. I am a white, cisgender, non-disabled person. So I do want to acknowledge some of those areas in which I hold power and privilege. Also, my experience is largely in academic libraries, and I've done a lot of research with academic libraries. But again, today I'm kind of pulling from the psychology literature to share with library folks in different types of libraries. So I hope that you'll find this information useful. We are still going to focus on not just what microaggressions are, but a little bit about their history and the research on them. And then also, spending some time thinking about how do we engage with microaggressions in a way that we can cope with them, take away some of their power, and hopefully make our workplaces more inclusive, more welcoming places. And so before we do kind of get started, I wanted to just do a quick land acknowledgement. I'm here in Auburn, Alabama, which is the traditional territory of the Muskogee Creek people. And I'd like to acknowledge the legacy of the Muskogee people for whom this land holds great historical, spiritual, and personal significance. And today I've made a donation to the Muskogee Nation Scholarship Foundation program to sort of put my money where my mouth is. And so some of our goals for today are to kind of understand microaggressions, how they are expressions of biases that we may have that we may not even be aware of, to work on developing some interventions against microaggressions, and really trying to interrupt, respond to microaggressions in a way that makes our workplaces, like I said, more inclusive, more equitable. So I'll start with just kind of a quick definition. I know a lot of people maybe have seen microaggressions, especially in social media or just kind of mentioned in various places. But I'm using a definition by Gerald Wing Su. So microaggressions are brief, everyday exchanges that send denigrating messages to individuals because of their group membership, because of part of their identities. And a couple things that I really want to point out here. Microaggressions are ways that biases that we have that we may not even be fully conscious and aware of, so racism, sexism, that maybe we have internalized, how those are expressed, how they come out into the world. So one of the things I want to stress is that microaggressions are often delivered unconsciously, and that doesn't take away the power of them. So for instance, if I step on your toe is still going to hurt, whether I meant to step on it or not. So when we do talk about microaggressions, sometimes we can get caught up in, oh, but I didn't mean it that way. And so one thing that we're going to do is really focus on the impact of the message that's being sent as opposed to the intent of it. And I also want to mention that the micro in microaggression doesn't mean that this is something small or insignificant. It's really used as a way to sort of talk about person-to-person interactions, that kind of micro level. And then I'll give a couple of examples of microaggressions. So one that I've seen really resonate with folks is, for instance, maybe you are at a conference meeting somebody for the first time, or maybe you're on a plane and someone asks you, where are you from? And so their intent may be to create some sort of connection, find that you have something in common. But for a lot of folks, especially Latinx, Asian Americans, and also Black Americans, once they answer that question and say something like, for instance, oh, I'm from Poughkeepsie, the other person questioning them might be like, oh, really? Like, where are you really from? Like, where are your people from? And so that kind of sends a message to that person that you don't belong here, or you don't look like what I assume somebody from Poughkeepsie looks like. Another example would be, somebody, perhaps a person of color, has given a presentation and it was just a stellar presentation. Someone might go up and be like, wow, you're so articulate, like what a great presentation. And their intent may be to give someone a compliment, and but unfortunately the way that it ends up being delivered, the underlying message that's conveyed there is, well, I didn't think that you would be articulate based on how you look, oftentimes. Another example would be saying, when I look at you, I don't see color. I know, especially kind of a neoliberal push towards color blindness seems like it is something positive that we would want to promote, but really that's just denying part of a person's identity. That's denying an experience or experiences that that person has based on their identity, because in our society we are treated differently depending on how we look. So we do oftentimes see color and respond differently to people in that way. So those are a few examples of microaggressions, of racial microaggressions. I also wanted to share with you kind of a select timeline, so kind of a brief history of microaggressions. It really starts in the late 60s, early 70s with Chester Pierce, Harvard psychiatry and education faculty member. And a lot of the psychiatry research at that time was looking at defensive mechanisms that helped you to prevent feelings of shame, for instance. And Pierce was advocating for looking at something called offensive mechanisms. And so he was talking about offensive mechanisms as basically being a way that racial superiority especially for whites over blacks, is enacted in that way. And one of the things that he says is that most of these offensive actions are not gross and crippling, they're subtle and stunning. The enormity of the complications they cause can be appreciated only when one considers that the subtle blows are delivered incessantly. So even though any single negotiation of offense can in justice be considered of itself to be relatively innocuous, the cumulative effect to the victim and to the victimizer is one of unimaginable magnitude. And so as we continue to look at research on racial microaggressions, that's going to be something that we see again and again is there's an emphasis on the subtlety of it and also the incessantness of it. So cut, death by 1,000 paper cuts, basically. In 1989, Peggy Davis looks at the law as microaggression. So she is discussing a survey commissioned by the National Center for State Courts and trying to explain why in this survey, minority people reported that they were convinced that the law would work to their disadvantage. And so in that, she quotes another lawyer, I believe, who's Charles Lawrence, who says that American racism is pervasive and largely unconscious. And basically, because it is so pervasive, the whole system is built on this racism, so it just perpetuates itself. We like to think that the law is a neutral tool, but it really is not. It just reinforces the status. Lawrence also had said that this cultural belief system has influenced all of us, and to that extent, we're all racist, and at the same time, we're unaware of it. And in the late 90s, we have Daniel Solorzano, who's an education faculty member, I believe at UCLA. And he, in 98, is looking at the experiences of Chicano and Chicana PhD students and using critical race theory as the lens to investigate their experiences. So in his work, we're taking race as a central feature of the story. It's not peripheral. There's an emphasis on counter narratives, and Solorzano also brings in gender as an aspect of that to be looked at as well. So acknowledging that perhaps women might have a different experience with some of these microaggressions than men. And then in 2007, we have Daryl Wing-Sue and his colleagues who work on creating a taxonomy of racial microaggressions. So they looked at a lot of the existing literature about aversive racism and just was already out there, and tried to bring racial microaggressions as the construct into it to describe the racism that they were seeing in the literature and to create a way to, like I said, a taxonomy so that you could actually study microaggressions and their effect on people. So they're trying to classify, delineate ways that microaggressions are conveyed, different themes that come out of them, and the forms that they take. In 2011, one of Daryl Wing-Sue's former students, Kevin Nadal, creates the Racial and Ethnic Microaggression Scale. So that's a tool that's intended to assess the prevalence of racial microaggressions experienced in the everyday lives of people of color. Nadal has also done a lot of work extending this idea of microaggressions into looking at sexual orientation and other stigmatized identities or marginalized identities as well. In 2019, Keon West looks at one of the early criticisms and persistent criticisms of microaggressions. Some psychologists, some researchers have said, oh, well, maybe people of color are just being overly sensitive. Maybe they're hypersensitive to these minor slights. And so West designed some experiments to test that theory, that hypothesis, and found that no, there was no evidence that ethnic minorities were any more hypersensitive or responded more negatively to these perceived slights than people who are from the majority. And then in 2021, there's a special issue of Perspectives in Psychological Science. And in that issue, Monica Williams, Matthew Skinta, and Renee Martin-Willett actually expand on the themes that Sue and his colleagues had identified from 2007. So they start looking at more of the research literature that's coming out specifically on microaggressions, and they're expanding that initial categorization that Sue and his colleagues came up with. So there is a long history of this research, and it's continuing to evolve. I did want to go through sort of from Sue some of those forms of microaggressions, so how they're conveyed. They can be conveyed through micro assaults. So again, micro meaning kind of person to person. In these, it's much more overt. So the intent is actually to harm somebody, to harm the other person. One of the criticisms of this particular conception of microaggressions is that micro assaults, because they are more overt, are kind of in a different category from the other ones that are a little bit more subtle. Micro insults, those are things that are often conveyed unintentionally. So again, somebody might be trying to give you a compliment when they say you're so articulate, but there's an underlying insult that's conveyed there. So those can be seen as, backhanded compliments or subtle snubs. And then micro invalidations, again, often unconscious, usually quite subtle, but they're messages that convey a denial of the realities of marginalized groups. So for example, the myth of the meritocracy, saying that race doesn't have anything to do with how successful you are or challenges that you might face. That could be considered a micro invalidation. And then kind of underlying all of these would be environmental microaggressions. So those would be things that perhaps you would see in your environment that aren't necessarily a person saying it to you directly. One example might be if you are in the boardroom of some company, or if you're in the library administration office, and there are portraits of all of the former directors of the library in that office. If all of those former directors are white men of a certain age, then there's an underlying message sent that if you are a person of color, or you're younger, or you're a woman, that you're not one of this group. You're not going to be welcome in that environment. And then I wanted to add some of the expanded themes that William Skinta and Martin-Willett came up with. So the original 9 that Sue and his colleagues came up with, they're in here. Some of them have just been expanded. So the environmental microaggressions have now been broken up into environmental exclusion and environmental attacks. So those environmental attacks would be more of those overt examples of, for instance, if somebody has a Confederate flag hanging in their office or in their house or outside their house. The environmental exclusion would be kind of like the example that I gave with the portraits of all of the former directors. So people from a particular group, their experiences are not seen or are not shown, they're specifically excluded. One of the things that they have added is on the color blindness or invalidating racial or ethnic identity. They've specifically added false color blindness to really emphasize that the examples from the literature are sort of showing that this pretending that you don't see color or you don't see difference is actually something that's preventing honest discussion, honest dialogue about racial issues. They also added reverse racism hostility because one thing that kept coming up again and again is this notion that whites felt like people of color were getting various advantages. So things like affirmative action or scholarships or something, there was this assumption that this other group is being treated in a different way, in a better way. They also added tokenism. So when a person of color is included simply to promote the idea of inclusivity. And so this is sort of the not walking the walk, but just sort of talking the talk. And then connecting via stereotypes. So in this example, people of color describe kind of awkward situations where white people are trying to connect with them, sometimes using stereotype speech or behavior. So the intent there is to make a connection, but the impact is the opposite of that, right? And one example from the literature was Asian Americans noted that they would be asked by their friends to teach them Vietnamese words or asked what to order in a Korean restaurant, those kinds of things. Also, the exoticization or eroticization theme is specifically broken out here. That's something we didn't see in Sue's original category, but it's when a person of color is treated according to sexualized stereotypes or perceived differences are characterized as exotic in some way, which seems to be particularly salient, particularly prevalent for Asian women and Black women and Latinx women. And I did also want to note a lot of my research, a lot of my interest is about race. So that's really what I have focused on is kind of racial microaggressions. But race, ethnicity, that's one piece of our identities. And so microaggressions can really be conveyed based on any aspect of your identity, especially if some part of your identity belongs to a stigmatized or a marginalized group. And where you are, your identity, like the intersection of your race, your gender, your religion, you might experience certain microaggressions, you might experience them to a certain frequency that's greater than somebody else who doesn't have those same kind of intersections. So I do want to emphasize that not all microaggressions are the same, not everybody experiences them in the same way. It really is very dependent on the context, the situation that you're in, and yourself and your identity. And in terms of kind of the consequences, the effects of microaggressions, if you're being given these subtle messages all the time that are telling you you don't belong, you're not one of us, you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, that I think it's pretty easy to see how that leads to self-doubt as well as frustration. It can also lead to anger. And one of the things that people tend to do, especially in a workplace, when they're faced with these messages that are conveying certain stereotypes, is they might try to work twice as hard. They might try to disprove that stereotype and be like, no, you're wrong. I'm not like this. I'm very competent. I'm very capable. And then that can lead to a lot of a lot of exhaustion. One of the aspects of microaggressions is your colleagues may exclude you from things. Even if they don't exclude you, you might move yourself away from colleagues if you're experiencing a lot of microaggressions from them, and that can lead to isolation as well. And so none of these are good for the individual, but it's also not great for the organization either, because it leads to a lot of decreased productivity, especially if you're having to spend a lot of time processing what's happened. And it can also lead to increased turnover. And if we think about, the money, the time that we go through to hire people, to train them, that increased turnover is definitely not something we want to encourage. All right, so now we're going to get a little bit more into ways to respond to microaggressions. And I'm really focusing on some principles and a couple of strategies here. And so one of the things that I've broken down the next section into is basically if you are a perpetrator of microaggressions, what are some things that you can keep in mind and do differently if you're a witness or a bystander, and if you're a target. And so a lot of these guiding principles will come from Thurber and D'Angelo. So for perpetrators, I know I certainly have perpetrated racial microaggressions. And even though I try not to do that, I still mess up sometimes. And so one of the things that's really important to keep in mind is trying to be open and receptive to feedback. So for instance, for me, I try to view this as if someone is telling me, hey, you've committed a microaggression, I want to acknowledge that they're giving me a gift. Okay, so they think that I'm worth telling me that I've done this thing so that I can hopefully do better next time. You can also, I think of it as, if you have broccoli in your teeth and somebody tells you, most of us do not get angry and stomp out of the room because we've been told we have broccoli in our teeth. We just, try to go get the broccoli out, right? Except in the case with microaggressions, it's not just I'm going to look kind of foolish here. It's actually I'm doing harm to someone else, which is not what I want to do. So this sounds easy, I think. Be open, be receptive to feedback. In practice, it definitely is something that can be very difficult. But lowering our defensiveness, and especially I think taking a moment to be like, okay, I did a thing, it wasn't good. Let me work on not doing that again, as opposed to just being angry and defensive. Again, focusing on the impact, not the intent. So I think one of the things that Thurber and D'Angelo talk about is accountability as a process rather than a procedure or something that you can check off of a list. So you kind of have to constantly be thinking about it and trying to be aware of, okay, so I didn't mean it this way, but this is how it came across. So now how can I do something different? How can I try to repair this relationship? And they do emphasize seeking restorative action, which is where you acknowledge your conduct, you articulate a plan to change your behavior, and you invite the affected person to share the impact of your actions, and ask them if they need to say or hear anything else in order to move forward. And I will emphasize that for this restorative action, the emphasis here is not on seeking forgiveness or making yourself feel better or being reassured that no, you're a good person. The purpose is to ameliorate oppression. And so if you're expecting to just sort of be forgiven, that's not the purpose of this. And so that is one of those things where we have to make space for the discomfort that we may experience there. So for bystanders or witnesses, Thurber and D'Angelo really encourage you to think about not necessarily getting it right or not focusing on, what you would gain by speaking up or by interrupting or interjecting, but really focus on what you will lose. So will your colleagues who might be the target of a microaggression, how will they perceive you? Will that damage your relationship with them? Will they think that you agree with the person who is saying this microaggression? Will they think that you condone that behavior? If you don't, then speak up. And I'm saying this as if there is a one right thing to do, I guess, in any situation, and there really is not. So throughout all of these, you have to think about the situation you're in, the context, and also the power that's at play in any of these situations. But you can also determine your goal. So do you want to change the behavior or the beliefs of the perpetrator? Do you want to show support or solidarity for the target of the microaggression? Depending on what your goal is, you might respond in a slightly different way. And then also, Thurber and D'Angelo really emphasized grounding your actions in care. So it's less about calling someone out and trying to call someone in. So it's more an invitation to reflect on and consider what has happened, as opposed to sort of calling someone out and making them feel shame or guilt. And then for targets, it's really important that first and foremost, your responsibility is to yourself, to nobody else. So if you don't want to speak up, you don't have to. If you want to take time to think about it, to process it, that's perfectly fine. And that's definitely what you should do, is think about how you can recenter yourself. Oftentimes when you are the target of a microaggression, you might feel like you're thrown a little off balance. You might be left sort of wondering, like, what happened here? Or this just feels like not good. So taking time to recenter, and that can include, physical activity. It can include a cultural or spiritual ritual. It can include talking to a friend, maybe somebody who shares your identity or an understanding ally. It can also involve quiet reflection, journaling, whatever you need to do so that you're not necessarily in that immediate feeling of, I have to do something about this, right? So taking the time, breathing through that. Also think about, what do you want to see happen? So you don't have to respond in the moment, and oftentimes it's very difficult to respond to a microaggression in the moment. I think a lot of us end up, it's neither fight nor flight, but it's freeze might be our response. So afterwards, as you're processing, after you have kind of recentered, thinking about, do you have a short-term objective? Do you want to talk to this person and express to them, hey, I don't like how this thing happened? Or when you said this, do you realize like what message was conveyed to me? Did you intend to do that? Because then I think a lot of us will recognize, no, we didn't intend to do that. But you can also think about, are there longer term changes that you want to see happen? So at your workplace, for instance, do you want to see policy change so that maybe microaggressions are less likely to happen in this way? That might require different action. And then there are ways to reclaim your voice. So you don't owe anyone a response. Sometimes silence is the best answer. You can use that silence as kind of a choosing not to engage, not taking on the role of having to educate someone else. But if you do choose to respond, if you do want to speak up, you can do that by speaking to the perpetrator yourself, by engaging allies, by trying to talk with your supervisor, or also talking with a support group or affinity group that you might be a member of. You could even start a political campaign. So it really just depends on what your goal is there. And then Sue and some of his colleagues, again, have come up with the idea of micro-interventions. So we have microaggressions and then micro-interventions. And so these are everyday words or deeds that communicate to the targets of microaggressions that their experiences are valid, that they value as a person, that affirm their racial or group identity. It conveys support and encouragement and reassurance that they are not alone. And those can be, those micro-invalidations can be done in a couple different ways. So one of the things for intervening with microaggressions is making the invisible visible. So naming that underlying message that's being sent. So for instance, why would you think that I'm not from here? Or what makes you ask this question? So trying to just alert the person, the perpetrator, the aggressor, alert them to the message that they're sending, and not letting that just sort of be an underlying thing, but putting it out there on the table, this is the message that's being sent. You can also disarm the microaggression. So I think for bystanders especially, that might be a little bit easier. So just expressing disagreement, like, oh, that wasn't funny, or I don't agree with what you just said, or that's not how we interact, that's not how we behave in this organization. Even just redirecting, like, oh no, we're not going to do that today. We're gonna focus on our work or this other thing. You can also educate the offender, and I would say that is definitely something that I would encourage bystanders to kind of take on some of that. It can be very hard if you're the target of a microaggression to have the space to educate somebody else, and also that's just another burden on you that, you know, I don't think it's fair for us to expect. But if you're a bystander, sometimes you are in a space where it will be easier for you to sort of interject and be like, hey, I don't know if you're aware, but that comment was really demeaning, or I didn't like that. I didn't like how this came across. And you can also do that by appealing to like our shared values and principles. So I know that you really care about this topic, and I don't know if you're aware, but that didn't, what you value is not what has just come through in this exchange. So that can be another way of kind of educating. And also seeking external intervention and support. So that can be sort of talking with affinity groups. It can be going to supervisors or administration to say, you know, this isn't working, or this is an issue. Let's find a way to make this a better situation for everybody. So for all of these, though, again, the context matters, the power dynamics matter. I would really like to be able to say, okay, in this situation, do this. Here's your script for responding. It's hard to do that because the context matters, and because in any particular situation, you have to pay attention to the power dynamics, and you do need to think about, especially if you are the target of a microaggression, thinking about your own safety and security as well. So I've provided, I think, some principles to think about, a couple of tactics for intervening or addressing microaggressions. And I would love to have kind of discussion, questions. I do have these slides are posted in my institutional repository, so we have references. So if you want to check out any of those, you'll be able to access them. And I'm going to turn off my sharing of my slides for our discussion.
Thank you so much, Dina. So yeah, please use the questions area if you have any comments or points of discussion that you would like to ask Gina. And we have roughly about like 20-ish minutes, so we do have some time.
So I think one of the questions is maybe like, how do you identify a microaggression?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is a great question. I think a lot of times, so I'm going to speak as a white person. I think a lot of times my initial inclination is always to like, oh, they didn't mean it that way, or I don't think that wasn't the purpose of this thing that they've said. And in a lot of my reading and research on microaggressions, and also on racism and perception research, it really comes down to the person who is in kind of the power down position. So if the message they feel that's being conveyed is negative or derogatory, then that's a microaggression. So I don't know if people feel like that's a useful definition. But that is the way that I see it.
Any other questions so far? Oh, Jeffrey said that was a useful definition. Thank you.
Thank you. And so I guess, I don't know, like one of the things that I think about too is, I don't know, there was this Dolly Parton story where she was talking about, I don't know, somebody told her like, oh, it was offensive or hurtful to some group of people to say something. And I'm a terrible storyteller because I don't remember any of the details of this, right? But one of the things that I was sort of impressed by is her reaction was not, oh, but I've said this word or I've said this thing for years. It was really about, oh, I don't want to hurt somebody. Okay, I'll stop. So I think, like, for me, thinking about it in that way, as opposed to like, am I treating people the way I want to? And if somebody's letting me know, like, oh no, this is not how I want to be treated, then I think it's it makes sense to me that I would try to do something different, right? And maybe I don't get it right every time, but there's an attempt, right?
Yeah. One of our questions is, how would you address a microaggression from your superior without being seen as insubordinate?
That is a great question. It's a very difficult situation to be in. I would say this is a great time to engage an ally. So in my situation, I'm at a public university, tenure granting. So I would have looked for a mentor or somebody else in my organization, maybe who's been there for a while, who has a certain degree of respect, and try to see if I could get them to kind of help me with this and kind of have maybe a side conversation with that person to be like, hey, I don't know if you're aware, but like this is a thing that's maybe not great. Maybe we could do this differently. I also have a colleague who I have seen, she has a really great way of, I think, disarming these kinds of things by just asking, like, what do you mean by that? And just continuing to ask until sort of the person kind of figures out, oh, yeah, no, that didn't land the way I meant it to. And so I need to, let me try something else. So some of it will depend on what type of microaggression it is. One of the examples that Sue has said, or has given in one of his articles, was basically if something is kind of, I don't want to say kind of direct, but like in the moment, if you can respond with like, ouch, that stereotype hurts. Like there's a whole training thing about ouch, that stereotype hurts. But that kind of thing of even if it's just frowning when somebody says something, or just being like, I don't think that, I'm not sure that landed the way you meant it to. And again, another colleague will just sort of say, did you intend, was this your intent, blah, blah, blah. It, but because of the power dynamics there, you do have to be very cautious,
Yeah.
I think.
Thank you. Grace has a question. Grace says, I'm sorry if I missed the beginning of the presentation. Does the definition of microaggression include the comments when a target is not present? I've experienced the difficulty of nodding along when there is no target present. It can be hard to speak up as a bystander in that situation. No one is getting actively hurt, but it probably allows an aggressor to continue thinking those microaggressions are okay.
Yeah, so there is, I'm not as familiar with this particular research. It's an area that I want to do more reading in, but there is definitely a thing that kind of happens when everybody seems like they're from the same group. And so there's kind of this assumption that we're all okay with certain things. I would say this is one of those times when it's extremely crucial for me as somebody who would like to consider myself an ally, to be like, oh, wait, time out. Like that's not good. Or I don't think that's funny. Or just some sort of statement to say, like, that's not okay. And I would even say, like, not nodding along, but if you want to furrow your brow and kind of like, like not a happy face, I think that can sort of help start to send that message.
Mhm.
Personally, I think as direct, well, I don't know. I tend to be a pretty direct person. Um, I might be described by some as the bull in a china shop. Um, so my preference would just be like, I don't like that. And it doesn't have to be about the person who's not there or the group who isn't represented. But it can just be like, there's something about this conversation, the way we're talking about this, that I don't like. It doesn't sit well with me. And that doesn't, maybe we don't necessarily resolve it or kind of fix that in the moment, but it does sort of let us know, we have some boundaries here that we need to work on.
Thank you. Another question that came in is, what if, and I think it kind of connects to what we were just talking about, is
Mhm.
what if there was backlash then when you tried to educate someone?
That is hard. um, I I think the best advice I could give in that situation is documenting everything that's happened in case you are in a position where you can share this with some other authority that could sort of stop that kind of backlash or retaliation or retribution. But then again, sort of enlisting allies. And I think that's another thing that for those of us who would like to consider ourselves allies, I think we need to recognize the power that we do have, as well as consequences that we may face. And that doesn't mean that it's not worth speaking up, but it does mean like kind of being prepared for that. So that's not a really good answer to your question, but that's a tricky
So,
spot to be in for sure.
thank you. Any other questions or comments from those both in the Q&A area or those in the chat? If not, it's completely okay because you're going to be getting Jana's information anyway. So if you have questions afterwards, you can always email her.
Yes. And I will actually do a good job of trying to respond to your email, I promise.
Thank you. Oh, we have one more. Is there a difference between microaggression and harassment?
I've not done as much research in terms of harassment, but I think so. I think one of the things that's difficult for talking about microaggressions is they tend to be subtle and not always actionable. I think harassment is usually to a higher degree, and oftentimes there may be some action that can be taken to stop it. And then, of course, if you're thinking about it in terms of a legal definition or legal proof that might be required, harassment, like that bar is a lot higher.
Mm-hmm. Got it.
But I do think of, microaggression is kind of harassment makes for an unwelcoming workplace, right? Actively hostile. And microaggression is sort of like a step before that, I think, where you're starting to develop that hostile workplace. You're certainly creating an environment that's not welcoming.
Yeah. How would you document a microaggression in the workplace?
I think it can just be if you have a notebook that you're keeping notes in for all the meetings that you attend, things like that, so it's contemporaneous and it's happening in that moment or shortly after that moment, sort of writing that out. Depending on how it's happening, you could also kind of communicate that via email to someone else. So if you wanted to sort of tell your supervisor, I had this meeting with so-and-so, this is what was said, just so that you kind of have this paper trail. I do think what's really tricky with microaggressions is, you can't really go to an employment lawyer, I don't think, and say, I'm experiencing a lot of microaggressions. Like, can we stop this? Legally, there's not like a lot that's actionable there, but I do think, if you're working with people who care, who are trying to make a good work environment, sometimes being able to show like this is what I'm experiencing in all 5 of these meetings with so-and-so, they've said this, this, and this, which has just undermined my ability to do my job. Sometimes you can get some resolution that way.
Let me just double check, make sure we have any other questions. Not seeing any. So I am going to wrap this up. First of all, thank you so much, Jana, for speaking with us today and answering our questions and just being part of this series in general. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you so much for y'all putting this on. It's something our profession desperately needs. So thank you.
Of course. And also, as a reminder, this is the last webinar of the series, and all materials that was shared will be sent around to attendees, as well as the recording at most a week after the webinar via email. And also by the end of this week, all of the recordings and materials shared will be posted on the website that is where you registered for the series in the first place. But that'll also be shared throughout the email as well. So thank you so much for attending this series, whether this was your first one of the series or if you attended several of the webinars. And we're looking forward to making sure that this series continues, and also make sure that you fill out your follow-up forms afterwards. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.